Good evening, everyone. Happy Climate Week, New York City, and welcome to Careers in Environmental Justice. We're so excited to welcome you to our panel this evening, featuring professionals working in environmental justice across an array of sectors. I'm Benjamin Kiesling, a postdoc in geochemistry at Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory.
And I'm Kailani Acosta, a fourth-year PhD student in Earth and Environmental Sciences.
I want to start tonight by amplifying the work and the words of the Native American Council at Columbia University. The Lenape lived here before and during the colonization of the Americas. We recognize these indigenous people of Manhattan, their displacement, dispossession, and continued presence. This acknowledgement stands as a reminder to reflect on our past as we contemplate our way forward.
We would like to thank the Earth Institute and the Columbia Climate School for sponsoring tonight's event. This event was imagined, planned, and made possible by Lauren Ritchie, a 20-year-old climate activist, writer, podcast host, and fourth-year student in sustainable development at Columbia. She is the creator of the Eco Justice Project, which is a digital platform that educates on climate justice, promotes intersectional climate action, and seeks to make sustainable living more accessible and inclusive by amplifying the voices of marginalized communities. She's also a writer and content strategist for Brown Girl Green, a youth ambassador for the Plastic Pollution Coalition, and the co-host of the podcast Black Girl Blueprint, a platform to center the voices and celebrate the accomplishments of young Black women in a vast array of fields. She is also the creator of Columbia Climate Conversations. Please join me in welcoming your moderator and host for the rest of the evening, Lauren Ritchie.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for showing up to today's event. And thank you to Kailani and Benjamin for that introduction. And again, always thank you to Phoebe, the Earth Institute, and the Climate School for making these events possible. I'm so excited to have all of you here today. I think it's also worth noting that it's been a year since Columbia Climate Conversations had its first event. Thus far, we've had 4 events throughout the past year that I'm so grateful for, talking about intersectional environmentalism, disability justice, youth activism, Caribbean activism. And because of that, I'm just so excited to have the opportunity to have this 5th panel and to introduce all of you to the amazing panelists that we have here for this conversation about careers in environmental justice. So without further ado, I will let you all get acclimated with all the work that they do. Starting off with Fuchsia, how about you just introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing, anything that you would like to share, that'd be great.
Awesome, great, can y'all hear me? Okay, perfect. Well, thank you so much to the whole team for inviting me and hosting this amazing event this week. My name is Dr. Fuchsia Hoover, and I am currently both an assistant professor of geography and earth sciences and environmental planning at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. And I'm also the founder and CEO of an environmental justice consulting company called Eco Green Queen. I don't know, I could keep going, but.
That's great, whatever else. I know you do so much, so whatever you want to share.
It's true. I guess the other big kind of project that I'll be engaging in alongside both my position as a professor and educator as well as a consultant is I'll be joining as one of the co-authors for a chapter on ecosystems, biodiversity, and ecosystem services for the National Climate Assessment 5 and NCA 5. And so that will be a 2-year process as well that I'll be bringing environmental justice work into. So I'm very excited for that.
Amazing, that sounds exciting. Okay, Anthu, do you want to go next?
Sure, thanks. That's hard to follow, Fuchsia. My name is Cynthia Hall, and I am an environmental attorney. I work for EPA, the United States Environmental Protection Agency in Region 2. We're headquartered here in New York City. My work currently mainly revolves around air and water compliance, but I also work with the regions and headquarters EJ programs. I also counsel various folks in the Agency on Environmental Justice, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, and various other civil rights statutes. I also work with the New York City EJ Advisory Board as a board member, and I've been a I guess lifelong advocate of environmental justice. And prior to entering the law, I was a university lecturer in ecology and evolution, and I worked in sort of the genesis of EJ way back when, before we had a name.
That sounds great. Thank you. Cynthia, do you want to go next?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. It's really exciting to be here. My name is Dr. Cynthia Hall, and while I'm a faculty member at Westchester University, and I'm an environmental geochemist there, and I study soil and soil contamination, which is really where my environmental justice work started. I didn't even know what environmental justice was until I started to study heavy metals in Philadelphia soils as a characterization of the soil chemistry. But then looking at who was living in those neighborhoods, I realized that there's this whole other field to intersect with. So although my background is in sort of the hard sciences, I found myself right at the intersection of this environmental justice work. So I've been a faculty member there at Westchester for, it's my 14th year there. And I also co-own and operate Free Haven Farms along with my husband. And we have a, relatively small organic farm operation where we grow fruits, vegetables, and herbs in South Jersey, but really focusing on distributing that produce to folks that don't normally have access to high quality produce in New Jersey, Philadelphia, as well as New York. And from that, we started a nonprofit, Free Haven Institute for Science and Agriculture, to focus on educational projects with both youth and adult populations. So I think that's for the environmental justice work, that pretty much sums up the work that I do. So I have a few different roles and a few different types of organizations, but the research that I do has allowed me to sort of fuse all those projects together, looking at soil quality for urban agricultural projects, as well as exposing more youth to science, as well as research opportunities in environmental fields, including environmental justice.
Amazing, sounds great. And last but not least, Rebecca, please tell us about all the great work that you're doing.
Hi, my name is Rebecca Iworks. Thank you, Lauren, and the rest of the team for putting this together. So I work at an organization called Namati, and what Namati does is we use legal empowerment as a tool to help communities know, use, and shape the law. And my role at Namati is to specifically use that as a tool for environmental justice, and to help. There are a number of amazing individuals and groups who have been using legal empowerment to do all sorts of things, like find administrative remedies for all sorts of pollution, or to kind of change the way the laws are structured to allow for communities to participate in conversations about what and when different investment will happen. And we've done some great scaling of that into some systems, but because of climate change, it needs to happen faster. And it needs to happen faster, both to prevent climate change and also because of all the huge amount of development that's going to happen because of climate change. And so part of my role is to work with these groups who have been doing this amazing work to figure out new ways to kind of help spread and sustain the work more quickly, and to see how we can do that kind of in a global way.
Amazing. Well, thank you all so much. I'm really proud of the group that we have here today. I think we have so many different facets of environmental justice represented, from nonprofit to academia and law, as well as just the governmental sphere, as well as consulting. And I think it's really showing that there's so many different avenues that you can take with environmental justice. And I think kind of as a grounding way to start off this conversation, I was wondering if each of you could just tell me a little bit about what a typical day in your profession looks like, whether that's about, working alone or with a team, or work culture, the amount of hours you work, whether you're in an office or in a field. I think that would be a great way to get people a taste of what your profession looks like. Feel free to go in any order, whoever would like to start.
I don't mind starting. And probably we'll all have the same answer, which is to say that there is no typical day in our fields, but I'll kind of go through at least being an environmental geochemist and what that might look like as a faculty member. So there's different types of days, definitely. So if I'm kind of thinking about the more research focused part of the day, it might include going to a site. And again, in particular, I do a lot of my work in Philadelphia. So I've gone to different sites in Philadelphia with my XRF, which is X-ray fluorescence analyzer. It's a field-based equipment. And it was actually in my little profile picture there. I think it's actually cut off. But anyway, it's a cool little tool that allows us to take it out into the field and study or analyze for heavy metals. The one that I've been really focused on is lead. That's the main culprit in Philadelphia for several reasons. But so going out to that site, typically, I would have the XRF with me. I would be giving a short sort of lecture / demonstration of the instrument to the community, and the community typically would be the folks that work at that farm site, as well as any interested community members. So it may be children, adults, whoever's sort of around, show them the piece of technology, and then actually use it right there on their site to measure their soil. And that's always, a very lively experience with the community. And then just on the sort of faculty side of it, if it were during the semester, a typical day would be more preparing for classes, teaching classes. I teach environmental geochemistry, so that's the course that's most aligned with environmental justice. And then working with undergraduate and graduate students on research projects, and really they're doing the bulk of the work, like at this point. But so working with them, meeting with them, depending on what stage they're in their research. As far as the other side of my life, which is actually more the majority of where I spend my time, which is on the farm, that is just all over the place, doing regular farm stuff, planting, weeding, maintaining, watering, harvesting vegetables. We do farmers markets. But on the nonprofit side of that, like this summer, for example, we had 4 weeks of summer camp where we brought youth to our farm, and we would have each group for a week. So we had 4 different groups of kids, and we engaged in science experiments on the farm and just did a lot of like exploration of nature. So that was like the bulk of my summer this year, and we had a lot of fun with the kids. And they range in age from 5 to 12. So yeah, it was a pretty dynamic groups of kids. So yeah, that was all over the place, but a couple of different typical days in those different roles.
I can go next. I share some field experience with the XRF with Cynthia. We've done lead enforcement in soil and in lead paint. So sometimes our engineers use XRF machines to sort of see whether there's lead in the materials they're looking at. And I, as an attorney, I mostly deal with evidence. So by the time it gets to me, it's written reports of what the XRFs read. But in our regional office, we're divided into branches. So each branch deals with a different, what we call media. And each media has its own statute to enforce and implement. So we have air, water, Superfund, toxics, and general matters like labor, information law, civil rights, things like that. We mostly work in teams. So we have teams of an attorney and maybe a couple of engineers and some, if it's a case that's heavily biology based, then maybe we'll have a biologist or a chemist, depending on the issue we're dealing with. Most of the time, it's the technical staff that's in the field in sort of environmental enforcement. But sometimes we do go out to visit sites or negotiate with violators, talk to our state and local partners. Sometimes we conduct cases jointly, and sometimes we work with the Department of Justice because they represent us in civil court. But outside of the EPA, I've also worked as an environmental justice attorney. And when I worked for nonprofits, I would go out and do trainings for communities to on legal rights, development law, zoning law, things like that, depending on the issue. Just like Cynthia, there's not really a typical day. We're all over the place. It depends on the issue that we're dealing with. The work culture in the government is very different from nonprofit and from academia. It's very structured and very bureaucratic. So basically, anytime you want to go anywhere, say anything, you have to get approval. But that's only if we're working within our official capacity as government employees. If we're doing things in our own capacity, like when I'm teaching at Mailman or when I'm serving on the city's EJ advisory board, that's using my own time and not using my EPA title. I can basically do anything that a regular person can do. The advantage of working for the government is that you have very definite hours. Of course, if you're sort of higher up in the agency, you have less privacy and less time. But it's because you have very reasonable hours, it's very possible to have both a home life and a professional life. And a lot of people appreciate that. So that's my typical day as an EPA employee.
Awesome. Okay, so I'm next. And I just added in the chat for those wondering. So unless it's changed, 9 a.m. to 3 are the core hours, at least at the EPA. So I was a postdoc at the EPA, so that was my obligated, you have to be in the office for at least these hours. And that's one of the reasons why I'm in academia. So, my typical day looks kind of similar to what Dr. Hall mentioned. Mondays and Wednesdays I'm teaching, and so often those days are fully dedicated to what am I bringing into the environmental planning class, what are the activities I'm going to do with the students. And then the other days, one of the things about kind of wearing two hats is in most university settings, you are limited to 20% of your time being able to dedicate that to something outside of your roles and responsibilities as a employed faculty member. And this was the case even when I was a postdoc. And so because my consulting is really separate from my research program or my teaching, then that means that 8 hours a week is kind of what I get to designate to Eco Green Queen, and for now that's worked out pretty well. I I founded my company in August of 2020, and so it's still pretty new, and I've only had a few clients. And so one of the things that I do appreciate about being in the two roles that I am is that I can really shift my day. And so, you know, maybe I start at 9, maybe I start at 10, maybe I even start at 11 if I've got things that are going to be going into the evening. Whether that is, you know, doing my consulting work after I'm done with writing and research, or you know, I've got a lot of meetings that are going to go late, or meeting with folks in California, different time zones. But as I start to build up my research program, a lot of my day-to-day will then begin to incorporate both things like site visits. So I forgot to mention, but my research looks at green infrastructure and thinking about urban flooding in particular, and how it impacts communities of color and the potential ecosystem services and disservices that are felt by those communities specifically. And so a lot of my work then incorporates interviews and doing more ethnographic based studies, as well as observations and monitoring of both green infrastructure practices and how they're functioning, if they're functioning, as well as how communities and residents are interacting with those spaces. And so as I start to build that work up, you know, I'll have more of my day that is going out and, you know, being in the community for several hours, or going to community meetings or planning meetings that are being hosted by the city, since that's really relevant to my work. But for now, most of it is on the computer or in the classroom. But hopefully that gives y'all an idea.
So I'm one of the few people in America who probably spent as much time on Zoom before the pandemic as I do like post-pandemic. And that's kind of what life at a global NGO is kind of like. It's a lot of Zoom calls. We used Skype before Zoom, but my mornings tend to be pretty heavy just because of time zones. So trying to have people in Asia or Africa be able to participate in conversations. But my afternoons are really flexible. So one of the wonderful things about, this isn't true of all NGOs, but where I currently work, is that we're really flexible about when you get work done. So if I need to pick up my kids from school or do other things, like that's really possible. And I don't often need to notify anyone, as long as I'm at things that I need to be at. The kind of downside of the NGO world, and this is probably true of all of these professions, is that there's always more work to be done than you can get done. And NGOs in particular are not always great at kind of setting boundaries and being disciplined about when to say no and how to kind of manage that in your own work plan. And so it kind of requires then for you to be able to learn to do that, and to kind of learn to figure out what makes sense in your life and kind of how much work you can get done and what you're comfortable with. And I've always found, like where I currently work and other places, people are very open to talking about that. Just in practice, there's always more that you want to do. The other thing I spend I spend some time on kind of just emails and coordinating. So I do a lot of learning sessions and kind of group discussions. And I spend a fair bit of time these days doing some legal research. I happen to be a JD, and there's some kind of almost akin to technical assistance that we're doing with some of the organizations we support. So some of the advocacy we've done, or the legal empowerment that we've done in Sierra Leone, for example, we've tracked the cases and seen what a lot of the land issues have been over a long period of time. And as a result of that, are able to input into some legislation related to land policy and trying to put a provision in for free, prior, informed consent. And so I've been helping with kind of research that backs up those arguments from a global standpoint as well. And then when travel is possible, this type of role often has a fair bit of international travel to it. And that usually looks like a couple of weeks at a time, traveling to different locations. Some of that The less fun part of that is often a lot of conference travel. So you're going to a conference center somewhere in the world, and it kind of looks the same no matter where in the world you are, and meeting with a lot of different people. And those are just convenient ways to get a lot of people together, right? So that's usually sort of thing. I find more engaging part is when you get to walk alongside people who are in the middle of doing that more direct work, and either sometimes we create learning exchanges so that there are others kind of learning from that practice, or giving feedback on that, or using the stories from that to amplify some sort of global policy ask.
Amazing. Okay, well, thank you to the four of you for sharing that. I do realize it's a difficult question to try to summarize all the work that you do and try to condense it into a typical day, but that was really great. And I think kind of since you've already talked about what your work looks like now, I'd like to take a little trip down memory lane, if you will, and talk about like what led you all to this line of work, whether that's reflecting on your own undergrad experience, whether or not you needed a post-grad experience for this, or even just like passions and unique skills that made you want to go into the field that you're in now. I think for a lot of undergrads, it'd be really nice to see what that trajectory or path looks like.
Yeah, so my pathway definitely didn't start out with the environmental justice focus at all. I was a chemistry major as an undergrad, and I really, really enjoyed chemistry on paper, but I didn't like the confinement of being in a laboratory all day. I had several internships when I was an undergrad, and I didn't like any of them. And I knew that I wanted to do, more in terms of the environment. And I guess that was just based on, my childhood. I was a Girl Scout and spent a lot of time, running around outside. And so for graduate school, I ended up studying geochemistry. In particular, I studied marine geochemistry. And that's sort of how I ran into Benjamin Kiesling, because we were on a research cruise together a couple of years ago. But so I was doing work in graduate school on, marine sediments, and it was a lot of field work. I was going out at sea for, a week to 3 weeks at a time. So I was spending a lot of time, out in the field. And that was interesting and it was cool, but it still wasn't like doing it. And so I didn't realize it at the time. I thought I was doing it until I sort of stumbled upon the research that I've been working on for the past 14 years. And that was because when I landed the job at Westchester University, my family and I, we relocated from Atlanta to Philadelphia. So we were living in Philly, which is about a 45-minute commute from Westchester, but I wanted to live in the city. So I lived in Philly. And so we had just, as a department, acquired the XRF. And so I went to the training that those of us who were interested to learn about the machine attended. And then they said, you can test it out. You can take it and go out in the field with it. And we had already become like, sort of gardeners. My husband wasn't a farmer at the time. He was a plumber. And so we just grew food for our family. And I brought the XRF home and I just tested it to see how it worked in my backyard. And I found lead in my soil in our garden, where our children, we have 3 kids, they're back there helping us, they're eating the food. And so it was like, it was a pivot moment, like right there, my career shifted. And it was the first year of my faculty position. So I was sort of wrapping up my dissertation anyway in marine nitrogen cycling. And I just wanted to find out more about this lead in the soil. At the time, I was living in Germantown, which is a predominantly African-American section in Philadelphia. And I was like, I wonder if that's connected. So I just started on my own, research and understanding the history of lead in Philadelphia soils, and that there were smelters all through Philadelphia, so on and so forth. And so so that's what led me to studying, led me to lead, but it led me to studying lead in the soil. And then from there, sort of my husband did his own pivot with his career, because he had to leave his plumbing license in Georgia behind, when we relocated, and ended up working at a farm in Philadelphia. And that's how I got plugged into the urban agriculture scene. So I guess my pathway into environmental justice, I mean, it literally started in my backyard, and from my own, family and what we were doing and interested in. So between my research in, urban soils, and then my husband doing farming, that's when we decided to start our own farm and do education and, science with youth, get more, especially, youth that are in cities that don't really get exposed to science and to nature and to agriculture, to geosciences, to all these different fields that I found myself in. And I was, usually one of few African Americans. And so I realized that those experiences start early, where you get that sort of bug, right, that I had caught being out in nature and wandering around outside. So yeah, we started Free Haven Farms in 2017. And I actually left my tenured position. I shouldn't be saying this in front of Dr. Hoover because I want you to stay. But I ended up leaving my full-time position, but I still teach in the same department as an adjunct. And that just sort of worked out with both of us in terms of the department's needs and my interest in staying involved as a faculty member. But it does offer me sort of more flexibility. I don't have the same constraints that I used to have. I always felt torn doing my work and still being an academic. And now I can, I more do my work full time and I dabble in academia. But it's nice to still have that, that foot in the door with sort of the resources that you have at being at an institution. But so yeah, that's how I got to, this environmental justice pathway as a scientist.
So I also didn't start with legal empowerment. Oh, sorry. I really come at legal empowerment from this history of working with movement building and with supporting communities that are kind of trying to foster change. So that started for me with working on the Thai-Burma border when we called it Burma, and so now called Myanmar, and also kind of before the initial coup, or so in the previous military regime. And working with communities there. I spent some time in different types of nonprofit spaces at some philanthropy institutions, and also working with some other coalitions like the Publish What You Pay Coalition. So that's one that works for fiscal transparency in oil mining and gas work. Eventually, at some point, I realized I was working with a lot of lawyers who seemed to know a lot of things, and I felt like they speak with really fancy words, and I felt like they must know something I don't know. And so I felt like I needed to, and I also got at a point in my career where I wanted to get some sort of further education. So I went to law school and got a JD, which some people hate law school. I actually found it like a interesting place. I appreciate your skeptical look. But I also kind of left feeling like, oh, they just use fancy words to explain the laws. I could have done that I went full circle in trying to still be able to speak regular language that is accessible and explain the laws. And so I think that's important. What I really like about, and that's what I like about working with Namati specifically, is that focus on being able to use law, but also having that be something that everyone can use and having that type of language. And so that to me is kind of the part of legal empowerment that's really exciting. Environmental justice that's really exciting is that it's not just addressing inequalities, it's also kind of letting everyone be part of that process of righting those systematic wrongs.
So I could go next. So I'm from an immigrant background and I grew up in the heart of LA. Most of my friends were Latino and Black, and sewer backups, air pollution. And I remember we had shut down school days because of air quality issues. And I read somewhere that growing up in LA at that time was like smoking 3 packs of cigarettes a day. So a lot of my friends and neighbors had respiratory problems, like I said, a lot of environmental issues, and it was a very low income community. And so that sort of equity issue has always been in me. And I pursued science. When I started in undergrad, I went all the way to my postdoc, and even though I worked with communities, Native American communities when I was a PhD student, developing habitat conservation plans, I never really got into the the meat of environmental justice and sort of the policy side of things until I was working in my postdoc and became really frustrated with how chemicals and environmental decision making occurs in the country. I was working in pesticides in the Central Valley of California, and most of the people there who were being poisoned by pesticide use were agricultural workers who were Latino descended. And because of that, many people were not documented, or they worked in labor camps and didn't really have the power to complain when their employers didn't have the worker protections that were legally required. But I felt very constrained as a scientist, because everybody was telling me, you can't have advocacy, you can't have a role in advocacy because that makes you lose your objectivity as a researcher. And after hearing that for a while, I just became very frustrated, and I said, I want a more active role in shaping decisions, and I want to be more in the thick of things. So I went to law school, but then I learned that the way that decision making and power in America works is that not necessarily by education or skill. A lot of it is by who you know and who is in power at the time. But having said that, I do feel I have much more of an active role in enforcing environmental laws and helping to shape policy in my current role. So that's my path, and I'm really happy that I took it.
I love this so much. It's so beautiful to hear everyone's stories and the different ways that, as one of my friends said, we're working within and against these systems to bring in environmental justice. And for me, it's kind of been a process of elimination, in that a lot of the way that I've gotten to this point was picking up things and seeing what worked and then putting down what didn't, and moving forward, right? Taking the next step. And my background's in engineering. So I studied mechanical engineering as an undergrad and was really interested in the environment and sustainability, but also really interested in urban communities. And when I started my PhD program in particular, I noticed that as I was reading about exceptions, and in particular at the time I was focusing on kind of approaches to increasing adoption among residents within urban environments of green infrastructure, which is, even now more of a concern because more than half of the world's population lives in cities, right? And so if we have so many people in cities and so much of that land is also privately owned, in order to have an effective green infrastructure program, you have to have buy-in from individual property owners. And in a lot of the research, actually like all of the research that I was reading at the time in the literature, race was never mentioned. If it was, it typically was work that was coming from more racially homogenous communities or countries like Japan. And, you know, within the United States, it was like race wasn't even a thing, or maybe they just mentioned economic status or income, which is important, but it's not the whole story, right? And so really, you know, the pushback that I started getting in terms of kind of bringing these questions and wondering like, okay, well, this is what the science is saying, but it's missing this, was this pushback of like, well, that's not a science question. And so I ended up picking up environmental justice because that basically allowed me to bring these questions into my science and to say, well, yes, like I'm an engineer and I'm thinking about stormwater management and green infrastructure, but I can now ask these questions because this part isn't engineering, this is environmental justice, right? And I'm merging these two. And I think that's one of the reasons why, you know, I've picked it up and oftentimes we do get that pushback about not being able or not being objective, or kind of the role of the researcher and how much of an advocate you should be or shouldn't be. And I think because environmental justice is rooted in activism and in organizing, that's something that feels in terms of how I'm able to do all of these different things. And you know, if and when I get pushback, right, I can point to that and say, this is the part of my work that this is speaking to and coming from. And so that's kind of been my journey as an engineer, as an urban hydrologist, and bringing in these things that have allowed me to ask the questions that I do.
That makes so much sense. Thank you all for sharing all of that. And I'm looking at the time. This always happens every panel. We just get caught up. I could talk to all of you for hours. And I think I do want to have time to get to the great questions that we've been getting in the chat. So I'm going to ask a final question. I'm going to warn you all now. It will be a bit of a loaded, packed question. I'm going to try to put a lot into this last one. But I was just wondering if you could talk to your past self, and I guess now you're talking to undergraduates or potentially you, what do you wish that you knew before entering this field? And kind of, I guess it's a twofold thing, like what advice would you give to anyone interested? And then if there are any opportunities for the people interested to get involved in your field that you know of. So a lot going on there, but please.
I guess I would say that for young people, I wish that I knew more about the art of negotiations, being empathetic and emotionally intelligent, and knowing how to resolve conflict or help people to talk through their issues in a productive way. I think a lot of the environmental conflicts that I've been involved in has been because a lot of people become very entrenched in their positions and they're not able to see the other side. And I'm not saying that the other side is necessarily right or valid, but I think it's important for us to be able to see how the other people think and how they came to their conclusion, because that's how you engage people in problem solving. I think if you shut off to other people's perspective, it's very difficult to come to a middle ground. And ultimately, decision making and policy making needs to be a middle ground. There needs to be a middle ground, even though you do have to give up some things, because other people have needs as well. So I guess my advice to younger folks who are looking to go into environmental advocacy is to learn to problem solve and to be more empathetic towards people who are not necessarily working in their on their side. The thing I guess I would advise folks as to opportunities is always volunteer. Volunteer to do anything that you might be interested in doing, because once you have those skills and once you have those experiences, you can move forward to the next level. But if you keep standing around waiting for that perfect opportunity to come, it won't. You'll have to create it. And the way you create it is to gain experience.
In the international environmental justice field, I would always encourage my former self and anyone else to get as deep language experience as you can while you're in school. I happened to go into undergrad and I was already fluent in French, and so I didn't think it was worth taking any courses. And I really wish that I had doubled down on that so that my written French was strong enough that I can really use it as a professional language, and didn't have to like spend time later to do that. Similarly, yeah, so any language skills that you have, it's super important. And there was a question in the chat about working with different communities and building trust and being able to speak the same language in a lot of different ways, right? But also the same kind of language in a traditional sense is really important, valuable to that. And then the best advice I got in undergrad was at a similar type of panel, which was to find a closet to clean wherever you were working. And that was a bit metaphorical of saying, there's sometimes some grunt work involved in work like this, that it's sometimes a lot of like meticulous spreadsheets or kind of organizing contacts or going through a lot of interviews that takes a really long time and doesn't feel particularly as exciting, and it doesn't feel like you're building a skill while you're doing that, but it's really valuable and valued by the people around you. And that's kind of how you have to gain that experience too, is by doing that grunt work. And so it's similar to, I think, the suggestion of volunteering is when you are at a workplace or at an internship, taking care of things like that are that might not feel as exciting, but really need to get done, is an important way to develop skills that you don't expect you're going to need, but also is just builds respect of the people around you to be able to kind of do more.
So yeah, I would add, thinking of my former self, thinking of myself as a chemistry major. So kind of, I think in the questions, I saw something about being a STEM major. So I would definitely say to students that are studying science that really feel like hardcore scientists, like I felt, or I guess I still feel, to just think about the impact of the science on the community, on civilization, on whatever part of science you're studying, whether you're studying biology, whether you're studying chemistry. Again, I was thinking about marine systems and thinking about climate change, but there was nowhere in my academic training that said who lives there. Think about, where that contamination is going, or think about, who's going to experience the sea level rise or whatever the issue is. So that's something that you have to, sort of do on your own. But when you're thinking about maybe going to graduate school, you have more control over your pathway and your area of focus than you think. Bring that in. That's something that, again, now I think that environmental justice is a thing. It's an actual phrase, where before it wasn't. That you can advocate for including that kind of work within your thesis, dissertation, or whatever. But I would say just to think about the impact of the science and not just the science for the sake of science. And I agree with what Rebecca said in terms of language. And that's something that I've always been big on. The thing you said earlier about language in terms of not speaking lawyer speak all the time. And I feel the same way about being a scientist, is that I don't always like to use such big scientific words that scientists like to use just to show how smart they are, but to speak more directly to people. to be able to send that message of whatever your research has found back to the communities that need to hear it. So that's the other part, is communication.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have too much. Oh, this is my internet connection is unstable too. So hopefully you can hear me okay. You know, not too much to add. I think as students, as you're thinking about your journey, whether you're an undergrad or a graduate student, so much about kind of how to either fold in equity or justice to your learning and growth, or even you know, your curriculum or research includes things like attending webinars, right, or listening to podcasts, but also, you know, doing a search for different community groups where you live. Who are the people in your community, in your neighborhoods, that are involved in climate change or activism work? And what are the ways that you can plug into those groups or offer your time, or, you know, you know, I think so much of what it sounds like from all of us, right, has been trying different things, right, and going over there and having that internship and thinking like, okay, I like this part, let me pull this in and keep this and go try something else. And I know that can be hard, particularly if internships aren't all paid. You know, a lot of my decision making and where I went was based on who was going to pay me to come there, right? And that includes things like internships, because I didn't have the ability to go take an unpaid internship. And so, you know, I think just trusting that because you all care and you're here, right, you're already on the right path. And there are certainly many different ways to go, and we are all evidence of that. So
amazing, thank you. We have 5 minutes left, and there's so many great questions to get to. I think, and through there's a specific question for you from Sophie Chan in the chat. But I think since a lot of these have been covered, I am going to ask my own question, because I'm too an undergraduate who has some questions and needs a job. So I would love to hear, just in the final couple minutes, what do you see from this environmental justice field, especially within your respective fields, as like the emerging areas of focus that we can see in the next 5 to 10 years? And when we're, you know, starting to grapple in these issues or in these careers, what do you think are going to be like the main priorities, or what's the shift that's going to happen?
In the last several years, when we talk about just transition and kind of involving legal empowerment, it's really been focused on climate mitigation or on kind of the prevention of climate change. And I'm really worried about the amount of development necessary, particularly the amount of mining necessary in different places, and the justice impacts of that, and the pressure to do that quickly, and who's going to be left out and hurt from that process. So that's kind of where I see like the new big area. And I think like the work that you've been doing, Lauren, in terms of using different medium of podcast and kind of different types of storytelling is critical to how we're going to be able to pull these threads together. And I don't know what that looks like yet, but I would guess that type of profession is almost as valued as these more traditional ones in going forward.
Yeah, I would say definitely. We've seen a huge uptick of people who are growing their own food, doing some type of gardening, especially when the pandemic first started. It really blew up in terms of people who were interested in, you know, having a little garden, being a little bit more self-sufficient, and just being healthier. All of those things, you know, sort of are answered by having a garden. And so from that, which is very, you know, positive, I always tell people you have to be careful in terms of your soil and soil testing. So I think that understanding our environment, the more that we try to get back to it and spend more time in it, just doing the sort of surveying is going to be really, really important. So I see that as emerging as more people grow their own food.
You know, I think I'll just add in the last couple, in that for the first time in a while, in decades, environmental justice and equity are actually being talked about at multiple levels of government, private and public sectors, in city planning. And I think it's, you know, I always have a bit of skepticism in terms of language and framing versus implementation. But I do think that it is really great to see that we are at a point where maybe we can push harder, right, and actually get some of these things folded into policies and plans, and resulting in real change, right? And we have amazing leadership, both from youth like Lauren, and all the way up to, you know, late career scholars and activists that we can draw inspiration and guidance from. And so, you know, I think that's kind of where I really see the, fingers crossed, my main priorities being anyways, and really pushing that through and prioritizing communities that have been historically excluded.
Yeah, and I think the emerging issues have been emerging for a while now, with the intersection between environmental justice and climate justice. And I think that a lot of climate impacts have visited upon folks of color and low-income communities. And I'm in awe of you, Lauren, of all the things that you've done to sort of uplift these issues on the multiple platforms that you work on, to raise these issues to a wider audience and to the youth, because I think that's the most promising part of all of our work, is that it's going to be carried on by the next generation. It's inspiring.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We're at 7 o'clock right now. I just want to thank you all so much for your time and the wealth of information that you've shared. This has been such an empowering conversation, I think, and just to hear so much about, you know, all the different avenues that they are within this field. I'm just so grateful to all of you for your time and all that you've shared, the knowledge. I think that's really great. And I think if we could end things off before we go, I know Rebecca and Fuchsia, you already have put your information so people can contact you in the chat. If you would like to do that before we end, so the people watching can reach out or connect with you in any way, that would be great. And otherwise, if nobody has any last words or final questions, we can wrap this up. So many people have said thank you. We're all so grateful for all of you. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Yes, thank you. Thank you again for hosting us. This has been a great.
Lauren.
Of course. Thank you. It's my pleasure. 100%. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
If you see my application, if I look to any of you for a job, I want you to remember this conversation. I'm just putting that out there just in case.
I'll remember you.
Oh, for sure. No, thank you, Lauren. Seriously, very inspiring, and you know, keep up the amazing work, and you know, spreading the message. And we just appreciate you bringing us together. And it was nice to meet all of you as well. So yeah, hopefully we can stay connected. I think we have some Twitter and Instagram pages being shared. So let's try to stay in touch.
Sounds wonderful. Yes, definitely.
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, thank you all. I won't hold you for any longer, but take care. Enjoy the rest of your evenings. And thank you to everyone who tuned in. And yes, thank you. Goodbye.